ticks are nature's dirty needle, right? And they carry a lot of stuff. And some of those things are going to be covered by doxycycline, but some of them are not. Like, for example, if that tick has Babesia, that's a parasite. It's not a bacteria. So antibiotics are not going to touch it. And you could still be sick even after going on a standard course of doxycycline.
Living with autoimmunity doesn't mean settling for less. Inspired Living with Autoimmunity is the show for high achievers who want the energy and vitality to live fully, not just manage symptoms. With your host and autoimmune coach, Julie Houghton. It's time to take your power back.
Nicole, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
This is such an important conversation, and we'll get into later. It's also very personal for me. So I'm so excited that you're not only have you shared your story and are you doing what you're doing to make diagnostics better, but it's a conversation people need to hear over and over and over again. So can you share with us how you got into this world of Lyme and co-infection diagnostics? Your story is so moving. And I think people really do need to understand the depths of not knowing what's going on, what that can cause and what it can do to families.
Yeah. Well, I got involved the way that most people get involved, right? When it hits your family. Colonel Nicole Malachowski says we're all recruited into this army by a tick, right? And that is definitely what happened on our end. So, it wasn't me personally, it was my husband.
Yeah.
He started presenting with, really, it was more mood-based symptoms. It was irritability, rage, it was depression, it was anxiety, things that you don't necessarily think you need to go to a doctor for, right? We went to therapy. We were struggling, even though we had never fought in our marriage. We were all of a sudden having all sorts of issues. And then I started realizing that he was also having cognitive issues, right? He was a brilliant engineer, electrical engineer, computer scientist, like extremely logical and rational human being. And then he was all of a sudden forgetting basic things, the time to pick up the kids from daycare, the time, the security code to our house alarm system, right? Basic things. And I had to convince this somewhat agitated individual that there was something wrong, right?
Yeah.
And that we needed to go to the doctor. And I did. And at his first doctor's appointment, he tested negative for Lyme disease. A lot of people enter the space and they don't even know to ask about Lyme. But as I started researching what could possibly be wrong, Lyme came up in my research, and it made sense because he had lived in multiple endemic areas. He was a hunter. He was always in the woods. He'd had lots of tick exposures, and he never had an acute form of Lyme, but it just fit. And so, so we had him tested. He tested negative, and to make a long story short, he was eventually diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Which, frankly, was like a baseball bat in the face, right? When we heard that. And to make matters worse, his PET scan said that he was in the late stages of decline.
Which is crazy.
So here I am still trying to convince him something's wrong, and then they're telling me he's in the late stages of Alzheimer's. And it was about 15 months after that first appointment when we kind of returned to tick-borne disease as a potential root cause, and I retested him for Lyme and found out that not only was he positive, but we also tested positive for 2 co-infections, specifically Bartonella and Babesia, which I didn't even know to test for at our first appointment.
Sure. Well, and nor should you have had to know because you weren't the practitioner. But I know sometimes we have to, and that's literally why we have the podcast is to empower people to be their own advocate or their partner, friend, whatever, because we are all in this together.
Absolutely.
So unfortunately, at that point, though, he did continue to decline.
Yeah, we treated, but again, it was 15 months after he had been given a late stage Alzheimer's diagnosis. And so he responded somewhat favorably to treatment, but the cognitive piece really never got better. And that's one thing people don't realize is the later you are in the diagnosis, the more difficult it is, especially
Right.
for the standard treatments. And so he ended up going into a memory care facility in 2019 and he passed away in 2022.
I'm so sorry. And you
Yeah.
had young ones at home too.
Yeah. I mean, when he went into resident care, my kids were 5 and 8,
Wow.
right? So seriously young. And it was the most chaotic and time of my life and the hardest thing by far that I've ever
Sure.
done.
Uh,
So
I'm so sorry for
thank
your
you.
loss and your family, and to take it and then make it your passion and help the rest of the world not go through that, is obviously a very big why for
Yeah.
you.
Yes.
And I want to highlight, so often we're hunting for a diagnosis, and you could have just accepted the Alzheimer's diagnosis as Alzheimer's,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, and that's the end, again, is we know now, as I'm a Recode certified coach, we know now it's not just like, oh, there's your diagnosis that explains everything. We still have to ask why. What
Yeah.
is driving it?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I want to start by kind of busting some myths around Lyme and the co-infections, and the testing, because I think that still allopathic Western medicine just doesn't get it yet.
Yeah.
And the first myth I want to bust, since I live in Colorado and I remember hearing this for years here, is, are there only certain places where you can contract Lyme?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely hotspots, right? In
Yes.
areas where it is more prevalent and in the tick population. But, if you look at the epidemiological data, it's really in all 50 states, right? And
Yeah.
so this is something that people will say, their doctors often say, well, we don't have Lyme in
Right.
our area.
Like,
And
we
I
don't
would
have
say that,
mold in Colorado. Sure we
yeah,
do.
yeah, you do.
Yeah.
I think one of my favorite, and I say that in quotes because it's not
Yeah.
necessarily good, but my favorite stories is, actually the genesis of Bay Area Lyme, which is one of the biggest funders in the research. And it
Interesting.
came from a group of women that, in their Girl Scout troop, a couple of the mothers ended up getting Lyme disease and they were told there's no Lyme in California, right? And so they literally started a foundation and started doing tick drags in the parks and found that, yes, actually
They're
Lyme does
absolutely.
exist in
Yeah.
California. And so
Yeah.
I always,
Plus, we do travel. We're
right.
such a mobile society.
We do. We do.
Yeah.
And
So,
then the other thing people say, and maybe it's another myth to bust, but people say, well, I don't go in the woods, right? And
right.
I, my favorite story about that actually happened to me a couple of years ago. I was in DC for a CDC roundtable, and I'm in the parking lot in the Westin, and my suitcase. It was kind of a sloped parking lot. My suitcase kind of rolled down the parking lot and
Yeah.
fell into the curb, right? And there was some grass there, and I took my suitcase and I wheeled it back over. And because of my experiences and because of my past histories, I started checking it for ticks because it had fallen in this tall grass.
Yeah.
And as I'm doing it, I'm making fun of myself. I'm like, Nicole, you are so
Right.
crazy. Like, this is not this. And sure enough, if I didn't find one crawling right across my suitcase,
Oh my
right? And I
gosh.
was about to take that suitcase and put it in my car and
Right.
kind of go from there. So, this was a parking lot, right?
Right.
In
In a
Virginia.
city.
And yeah, so it's unbelievable. And I think that people just don't realize these ticks are so small and you might not necessarily know.
Yeah. I know where I grew up, it was the deer ticks that were the
Yes.
biggest problem, and they're so tiny. It's
Yes.
not like the big juicy tick you pull off your dog. Like they are, and so thank you. So it is everywhere.
Yes.
And so that's one myth. Another one that I think still is, even people that are, well, I'm going to back up, switch my order, but I never got a bullseye.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, that is. Yes, the research is very clear about this. So if you look at stuff out of Johns Hopkins University, where they've looked at a lot of Lyme patients, it actually shows, their studies show only 14% of patients get that classic bullseye rash, right? Another 60% of people will get a rash, but they're often misdiagnosed because they don't have that classic bullseye shape. So maybe they're diffuse, maybe they're a different color. So they get misdiagnosed as other things. And then about 30% of people don't get any rash at all, right?
Wow.
And so yeah, no rash. You don't, like, again, my husband did not have a rash and a fever, right? No indication that he had acute stage Lyme, or that Lyme, that he got it at a particular moment that I can pinpoint.
And we're going to dig into that, because the bullseye is actually a good immune response, like correct, that your body is reacting. But more cases, as you just gave us all of the, more cases don't have any pinpoint thing. But for the people that do,
right,
if they go to their doctor and they're like, I got bit by this tick, they're still being told they don't need to test the tick necessarily. Yeah. Do you buy into that?
I believe in tick testing, and I think everybody should do it. Not necessarily that means that you have that pathogen, but it means you've been exposed to the pathogen, right? And you should be testing the tick not just for Lyme disease, but for any co-infection, because ticks are nature's dirty needle, right? And they carry a lot of stuff. And some of those things are going to be covered by doxycycline, but some of them are not. Like, for example, if that tick has Babesia, that's a parasite. It's not a bacteria. So antibiotics are not going to touch it. And you could still be sick even after going on a standard course of doxycycline. So yes, I believe in tick testing. I also know that just because it's in the tick doesn't mean that it got transmitted, but it does mean that you are potentially exposed, and that you should be considering that in your differential anytime you get weird symptoms. And it doesn't have to be right after the tick bite. It could be months to years later. If you start feeling fatigued, or cognitive issues, or joint pain, these are things that, you should be thinking back to that period. Hey, I did get exposed, and maybe this is something that I didn't get a severe acute response, but has led to these chronic symptoms.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting. And it is often not necessarily like Lyme per se that is, so detrimental for people. These co-infections are, and so I want to highlight, because you already busted the next myth I wanted to talk about, which was like, okay, I got bit, I had a bullseye, I went to the doctor, I did my round of antibiotics, I'm fine. Right? No, I was treated, it's gone. Not necessarily.
No, not necessarily. And the research is very clear about this, is that the pathogen can persist after antibiotics. And percentage of patients, ironically, it's 14 again, which, 14% of patients develop long-term chronic symptoms. And there's a lot of reasons for that too. Like, it could be that there's persistent infection of Lyme, right?
Yeah.
That has been definitively shown that the standard course of antibiotics is not necessarily effective. But it also could be other reasons. It could be an undiagnosed co-infection. It could be immune dysregulation caused by the pathogen. It could be remnants of the pathogen that are causing an ongoing immune response. And so there's a lot of things that could lead to ongoing symptoms. And that's why it's really important to go and get accurate testing to figure out what's going on, because if you're giving the wrong treatment, like I always say, if you don't know what you're fighting, it's difficult to win.
Sure.
Right? And so understanding what you're up against and what's causing those symptoms is really critical.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I want to talk a little bit about kind of back to your husband's story as far as symptoms that even practitioners and clinicians may not necessarily immediately be thinking Lyme or tick-borne. But I just want to kind of give listeners, because it's a varied list, but there are certain, what your husband went through. I mean, obviously very severe to get to the point of late stage Alzheimer's, but the shift in mood is so common.
Yes.
I want to just kind of touch on some of those, and again, it can almost present as anything. So, but what should get people thinking, I may need to dig deeper down this path?
Yeah, and that's one of the things when you first start looking at the research and you first enter the space that, I'm an engineer by training, and it was one of those things that didn't make sense. It's like, okay, how can this one pathogen be the cause of such differing symptoms?
Right.
I went into this space with a healthy skepticism of okay, this can't possibly be the root of these various diseases. And I think what I would say to that is, when you understand the microbiology, it actually makes sense, right? Because the pathogen can go in and it infects all sorts of different tissues. And so if it infects your brain, you're going to have cognitive issues. You're going to have, forgetfulness. You might have mood issues, right? You might have things that are impacting your behavior. If it goes into your joints, you're going to have rheumatoid arthritis and joint pain. If it goes to your heart, you're going to have carditis and inflammation. And so where it infects your tissue matters, and it leads to these different symptoms. That being said, on the other end of the spectrum, it's not the root cause of everybody's illness.
No.
Right? It's just something that should be on your thought process. If you've got these weird symptoms and they don't, the reason I dug further in my husband's case is, he was relatively young. He had no genetic predisposition towards Alzheimer's, and he was declining way more quickly than anything that I had read in the literature. And I'm like, this just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit, it's this is not a typical, if he had all these genetic markers for Alzheimer's disease, I would have said, oh, okay, this makes sense, but it didn't. And so I'm like, there has to be a root cause and a reason why my husband's brain is destroying itself, right? He's very healthy otherwise.
Right.
And anytime you feel like it doesn't fit, anytime there's a sudden onset of symptoms, particularly if it's after some sort of exposure or trip, animals are a common exposure risk. A lot of people don't think about that. So that's the diversity of symptoms can be really challenging, but that's why I always just say, look, it's just something to test. I'm not saying it's the root of all evil, right? But it's something to think about.
Well, and the reality is, and I used to, 9 years ago, I would get frustrated when my husband would say, because some people do really, they go down the Lyme rabbit hole and they stay there.
Yes.
And it's the cause of everything. And it's the reality is we also need to, and it's sneaky, and we're going to talk about that because I want to get into why the testing of the past hasn't been, how can your husband have, and you already gave us a clue when you talked about the tissues, but we'll get into that. But ideally, we get exposed to something, we get an immune response, and we knock it out.
Right.
That's are there a lot of people probably walking around with Lyme that are totally healthy and feel fine, that had been exposed? Yes. That's the ideal scenario. And so I want to talk a little bit about, what is different, because you didn't, obviously, you're not on a mission to get rid of all the ticks, although that wouldn't be terrible.
I'd be okay with that. Yeah.
But you're on a mission to improve testing so that we can actually know what we're going after and go after it and get it. So explain a little bit about why are these infections so tricky, to find, and then sometimes also to treat.
Yeah, that was the key thing that I kept going back to is like that
Yeah.
first doctor's appointment. I was like testing for Lyme disease. It was
Yeah.
the number one thing I wrote in the email to the doctor. And then he tested negative. And so I'm like, how is that? Again, why? Right? I like to
Yeah.
ask the whys. And so the reality is that the standard of care test that most people will administer when you go to the doctor is 30-year-old technology, right? It is, and and the reason for that is it's a really tricky little organism, right? So if you think about across infectious disease, right? Just we all kind of got a little bit of a crash course in COVID,
Yep.
right? Generally across infectious disease, you're looking at a direct testing method. So PCR testing, antigen testing, et cetera. But that's for a pathogen that is in relatively high levels in your body. And these are known as stealth pathogens, right? They're
Right.
in low quantities. They hide, like you said, they hide in tissues, and they actively evade and suppress the immune system. Like they're
Yes.
very sophisticated. Lyme is, my head of science at Galaxy is amazing. She went into this field because she's like, I like Borrelia because it's different and it breaks all the rules, right? It's not like other
We need
organisms, other
people who
bacteria.
like Borrelia so that we can get ahead of this.
Yes. And it breaks all the rules and
Yeah.
it actively suppresses the immune system. But then so it's very difficult to get with those direct tests.
Right.
So what have we done for the last 30 years? We've
Just keep
used
testing.
antibody testing. We've
Yeah.
used antibody testing because that's saying, okay, has a person been exposed to this pathogen? And it's evidence that that might be a problem. The challenge is that, again, you have a pathogen that actively suppresses and evades the immune system.
Right.
And we all have different immune systems. Some might have a robust immune response and get that bullseye rash.
Right.
But some people may have zero response, right? There's 30% of people that have zero rash at all.
Right.
And so are they having an immune reaction? And the answer is no, especially in the early days. And I think more so in the chronic stage than the literature would say. Like my husband, he wasn't producing antibodies because he had been probably had these pathogens on board for a long time, kind of
Right.
smoldering, like a little smoldering forest fire, right?
Yeah.
That's gradually doing damage. And so his overall immune system was suppressed. And he didn't have high antibody titers. We did his IgG titers eventually and realized he was low, right? And not
Yeah.
responding. And so that was
Well-
why he tested negative on the test.
Yeah. And our audience as an immune, autoimmune population, you're going
Right.
to get this group of people who, either have low antibodies. I love that you did highlight, this is one root cause driver
Yes.
of autoimmunity, as well as all of these other ways it can show up, which
Absolutely.
there is all kind of technically autoimmune if you think about what's going on. And so okay, so antibody testing it's gonna miss a lot of people.
It's going to miss a lot of people, and it's also going to not necessarily be helpful.
Doesn't mean it's active either.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I have going back to my COVID example, I have
Sure.
COVID antibodies,
Sure.
but that doesn't mean I have COVID right now.
Right.
And so that's the problem that we see, especially in those patients, like you mentioned earlier, where they've gotten treatment and they still feel terrible and they go
Right.
back to the doctor. And even if you have antibodies, that's not really going to tell you if the pathogen is still there, if it's, again, another co-infection, if it's residual pieces of the pathogen. There's a lot of reasons, and the antibody testing isn't going to help you
Yeah.
to figure out which one of those root causes is really leading to the ongoing symptoms. And so it's broken across the spectrum of
Right.
disease. It's a useful tool, it's
It can
something
be
that
used properly.
Yep, used
Yeah.
properly and as a piece of information, but direct detection and solving that problem of getting a test that is sensitive enough, and then frankly going after the right sample type, because you have to understand the microbiology of these pathogens and figure out what's the
Catch
best
'em.
method to attack and to catch them. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's the challenge, and that's what we're focused on at Galaxy, is solving that right problem.
And so how are you guys doing it differently?
Yeah. So for Lyme disease, one key thing to know if you're trying to go after it directly, Lyme does not like to be in the blood, right? It very quickly disseminates and hides in tissues, and it's not free circulating. And so I always say to people, you can't find what's not there, right? Like if it's not in the tube, and not there doesn't mean not in you. It means not
Right.
in the
Not
tube.
in that little sample of blood they took out
No.
of you.
Correct. And so, blood really is a difficult sample to work with when you're trying to diagnose Lyme disease, particularly across the various stages of the pathogen.
And that's all of the testing that's been done for so long.
Yeah. And it's one of the reasons it's been so challenging in this space, and there's been so much misdiagnosis. And so, but if you understand the microbiology of the pathogen, that's where it gets interesting. And researchers at both George Mason University and now at Virginia Tech and now Northwestern have really shown that one interesting thing about this pathogen is it sheds its surface proteins, either as part of its immune evasion techniques, or the work out of Virginia Tech and now Northwestern has shown as part of its life cycle. Like every time it replicates, it sheds these antigens into the environment. And those antigens get filtered through the kidneys and then aggregate in the bladder and excreted in urine. And so one of the things that's been shown by these researchers is that you can utilize this to do direct detection, right? And what we do at Galaxy is we concentrate these antigens and then use them as a way to detect from a urine sample. And urine is great from a microbiology standpoint, but it's also great from a patient perspective, right? It's a lot easier to pee in a cup than it is to get a blood draw. I mean, I know from my son, I've had to get blood draws in the past, and it is not fun to get a 7 or 8 year old kid to get a phlebotomy done. But peeing in a cup is very easy. Yep. And it's you don't need a phlebotomist. It's easy to do. So that's what we do for Lyme disease. And it's really a groundbreaking approach, not only for, discerning between some of like what's going on if you're antibody positive, but most importantly, the early stage infection, right? Because even with a healthy immune response, even if you do generate antibodies can take 4 to 6 weeks to peak, right? And that's the best time that treatment's the most effective, right? And so you're missing that window. And again, studies at Johns Hopkins have shown that even a 30-day delay of treatment can over double your likelihood of developing ongoing chronic symptoms.
Wow.
And so early is better, and antibodies that's not how the immune system works. And so direct detection, we've shown that, great results within first onset of symptoms. And there's new research out of Northwestern that's showing, even before, within days of initial infection. And so I think that's something that is really critical for accurate diagnosis.
Yeah, that's amazing. I want to talk a little bit about these co-infections, especially the common co-infections, the bees, because I really do feel, so I had said this is personal to me. My father passed away at 54 in his sleep. I believe now, knowing what I know now from co-infections from Lyme, it was the early 90s, and so we weren't nearly this far along in understanding Lyme and the but he was being treated at Rutgers, who was leading the charge at the time, but he was also allergic to penicillin, and so it was and that was kind of the only tool in the toolbox back then. So I want to talk about that too, because antibiotics aren't necessarily the only successful treatment options, which is good news. And I'm not antibiotic. It's nice the more tools we have in the arsenal so we can customize treatments, the better.
Yes.
And so he actually had his symptoms hadn't changed, but he had just been diagnosed Lyme free. right before he passed away.
Oh, no.
And so, knowing what I know now, it's like, oh, it kind of makes perfect sense, especially knowing what some of his symptoms were. And so it is a very personal conversation for me as well. Because and again, we've come a long way. But even treatments have come a long way. But if the testing is not there, like that only is helping a few people. And so talk to us a little bit about you mentioned the urine for Lyme, but talk to us about Bartonella and Babesia and some of these more common, really, like you said, crafty co-infections.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like I said, ticks are nature's dirty needle, right? So there's lots of stuff that's on board. And at Galaxy, we're really focused on the trickiest ones, which, as you mentioned, are the 3 Bs. So Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia. And they're also pathogens that have been shown to really be linked to chronic conditions. And so that's, they're really similar. Babesia and Bartonella are very similar to Lyme in that they're also low abundance pathogens and stealth infections. I think historically Babesia has not been thought to be in low abundance, but we were founded out of NC State University, and research over at NC State using Galaxy's technology has really shown that actually they are. And there's a lot of really low abundance infections that are linked to some of these chronic fatigue, ME/CFS, and other conditions that would not be triggered positive by kind of the standard LabCorp Quest results that could be really causing some of these ongoing chronic symptoms. And the other important thing to know about these pathogens is that they require different treatments. So Bartonella is also a bacteria, but it's very different from Borrelia, the bacteria causing Lyme disease, and it requires a different antibiotic protocol. Babesia is a parasite, right? And the treatment for that is is generally anti-malarial drugs are what doctors are using. And so knowing which one you have on board is important. Another thing I would note about Bartonella, because people tend to hyper-focus on ticks, but Bartonella is actually is spread by a whole host of vectors, and it's generally considered more of a flea-borne transmission. And so, I encourage people to think beyond ticks because, cats are reservoirs for Bartonella, just natural. They're like a natural host, just like mice and deer are for Borrelia.
Right.
But, for Bartonella, that's cats. And a lot of us have cats in our homes. And if you have a flea infestation, or if the cat scratches you or licks an open wound, that's an exposure. Right. Wow. And some of the stories, one of the stories that's so challenging but also vindicating is there was this young boy that had sudden onset psychosis, right? Dr. Breischwart has a published case study, and he was homicidal and suicidal, and his parents had to institutionalize him. And as it turned out, he had Bartonella, and the symptoms started after they adopted a kitten. And, with the appropriate course of antibiotics, he got his life back and went back to high school, graduated valedictorian of his class, and really went on to, be what he should have been without this devastating disease, right? But if that had not been identified and treated, think of what his life would have been.
Awful. That would have literally ruined his life. Yeah.
And mental illness. So Bartonella is associated with schizophrenia, right? So that single case study, we call him Michael. That's not his real name,
right. But good.
Yeah. That single case study really inspired Dr. Breischwart, our founder, to say, well, how many other schizophrenia patients could potentially also get their lives back? And so they ran a study with the University of North Carolina and did a pilot study on schizophrenia patients and found that 65% of them were PCR positive for Bartonella. And that study was halted by the COVID pandemic, right, as a lot of things were.
Sure.
So they did a larger study after that with Columbia University, looking at over 100 patients with, control groups and so forth, and found that this was a diagnosis of psychosis, so somewhat broader than schizophrenia. And 43% of those patients were PCR positive for Bartonella, which was statistically significant over the control group, right? So again, how many of these people can get their lives back with the appropriate diagnosis and appropriate treatments? And then Babesia is emerging, and Dr. Breischwart is finding that is linked to chronic fatigue syndrome, and again, in quantities in the blood that are not detectable by traditional methods, right? You really need the sensitive techniques that we're doing at Galaxy. So back to your original question about how do we do the testing?
Yeah.
We have a blood-based panel for co-infections, because just like Borrelia doesn't like to be in the blood, some of these other pathogens, even though they're in low abundance, they are in the blood. And so, but they're in low quantities. And so what we do is we do enrichment capabilities where we're kind of increasing the quantity. And then we're using an advanced technique called digital PCR, which really the best way I can give an analogy for that is like regular PCR, like what you would get for COVID. If you use that for these pathogens, it's truly like trying to find a needle in a haystack, right? You're trying to find a little bit of pathogen DNA among all of this human DNA. And it's just not capable of doing that reliably. So what digital PCR does is it takes the haystack and it separates it out into 26,000 piles. And then it interrogates each one individually. And as you can imagine, it would be a lot easier to find a needle in that smaller haystack.
Sure.
And so that's what we're doing for for what we call our BBB assay. And you might ask, well, why are you testing for Borrelia? Because you just said that it doesn't like to be in the blood. But that's Lyme Borrelia. So there's actually two different groups of Borrelia. There's Lyme Borrelia, and then there's relapsing fever Borrelia. And they're different. Again, it's all back to the microbiology. They're even spread by different ticks. Relapsing fever Borrelia is spread by soft ticks. Lyme Borrelia is spread by hard ticks. And so relapsing fever Borrelia is in the blood and can be seen. So generally, if we get a PCR positive for that, it will capture Lyme if it's in the tube. But generally, when it's positive for Borrelia, we say it's likely relapsing fever Borrelia.
Gotcha. Thank you I was going to ask you because I'm like, wait a minute.
You just told me. I know.
Let's explain that.
Yes.
So you also do offer this combo test where people can do the urine as well as the blood.
Correct. And we also have Bartonella serology. Really, our company was founded on Bartonella because that was what Dr. Breischwart really helped put that pathogen on the map. And if you Google it, you'll see cat scratch fever, right, which is the acute form of the disease. But just like Lyme disease, where some people have an acute reaction, a lot of people in Bartonella, don't. And then it can progress to these really complex symptoms, which, like I said, can be mental disorder, health issues. It can be anxiety, OCD. It's been linked to PANS PANDAS for people who are familiar with that diagnosis. And so, it's really critical that, you understand and get tested for a whole host of pathogens. And there's others. So we don't currently test for some of the other common pathogens like Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, Rickettsia. Those are even more bloodborne and they're in higher abundance. So generally, the standard testing from LabCorp and Quest will work quite well. Eventually, we'll incorporate that into our BBB panel just for convenience. But for right now, we're really focused on the hardest ones because that's where the biggest gap is in testing.
Sure. That makes perfect sense. And I want to go back. You did say it earlier in the conversation, but I want to highlight that there can be a significantly delayed onset of symptoms.
Correct.
And so, you don't need to remember a tick bite. You don't, that this is, I call them, since I didn't go to medical school, the rocks we look under when we're dealing with any of these chronic conditions. And I do think I think that the mental health changes are perhaps the least well recognized for like, oh, we should look under these rocks.
Yes.
And so that was one of the reasons I really wanted to highlight those, because I think that is an area of health where not enough practitioners are asking why, what's the root cause. Whereas autoimmunity, hopefully, eventually, everybody will get to understanding that, hey, we can find these root drivers, just like Alzheimer's. And I wanted to kind of highlight, as you're talking about, like, wow, we can treat somebody with schizophrenia, that actually had an infection and their symptoms resolve.
Right.
Your husband, it was too progressed. People don't realize that like amyloid plaques are really a protective mechanism.
Yes.
And so, what looks like or is technically diagnosed as Alzheimer's was really the body trying to protect him from those infections. And so obviously sooner is always better.
Yes.
But what you guys are doing is amazing, because this has been such a complicated, complex issue for so long that we just haven't had good tools for.
Absolutely. And, I think earlier is definitely better for sure. But there are many published case reports of people with a diagnosis of dementia that return to normal function with appropriate treatment. But appropriate treatment means really getting all the pathogens. And so I think my husband was really progressed in his disease, but I also don't think we ever adequately treated the Babesia.
Gotcha.
And that is something that might have held back his healing. I don't think at the time of being a caregiver, I truly understood the importance of that pathogen.
Sure.
And how it really is different. It's still emerging research, right? His case will hopefully be published later this year, because I donated his brain to a researcher that studies the linkages of pathogens and Alzheimer's disease. And there's evidence of Babesia in his brain. And it's a type of Babesia that until recently was thought to only be in deer and not be a human species. And it's a different type of Babesia. It's a sequestering Babesia, which behaves differently than the one that you might read about in the CDC website. And so again, because I was relying upon the research that was available at the time, it didn't really fit his symptoms. And, I didn't fully understand the importance of that pathogen, but I do think that it was potentially one of the major contributors to his disease state. So back to, if you don't know what you're fighting, it's hard to win.
Yeah.
And I think that's where getting an accurate diagnosis is so critical.
Yeah. How can listeners, because I guarantee you there's a good percentage of listeners that are like, oh my gosh, I want this testing. Not every doctor is even familiar with Galaxy yet. We're going to change that. But is there a way for them to find, if they go to their doctor and their doctor's like, I don't do that. I don't know how to order that. Where can they get some guidance?
Yeah. So our website is a great resource for both providers and patients. And we really, because this is an emerging field and because we're really close to a lot of the emerging research, we try and provide as many educational tools as we can, both for providers and for patients, because patients are often their own advocates, as I had to be for my husband.
As we should be.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, so on our website, if you're a provider, it's very easy to sign up. If you go up and set up an account, we've got a fantastic head of sales that will reach out and provide all the info that you'll need. And she's an educator, so she's happy to share all that we know and really get on as we develop new webinars and topics. That's a great resource to really learn about what's emerging in the space. And then for patients, similar, we have things that you can take to your doctor to get them to order the test. And we have a lot of doctors that order on the patient's request. They're not necessarily going to be
A Lyme
heavy power
specialist.
user, right? But just, hey, order this test for me. And if your provider won't order the test for you, and you're advocating, then I would say try and find another doctor.
Thank you.
Because it's really there's a lot of, even in the allopathic traditional medicine space, there are a lot of practitioners that will order the test, and we have all sorts of research papers and science behind our technology that you can use to bring to the doctor to be like, look, this is not some quack test that I'm finding. This is backed by literally 450 peer-reviewed publications and well-documented science that shows this approach works, right? So that, I would say that the best place to start is our website, and then we're happy to engage and provide any support in that journey if we can.
Yeah, so amazing. So we're at the point of the conversation where listeners are leaning in to hear what is Nicole's one step that they can take starting today to support their health. And it may not be related to what we just talked about. Anything.
I think it's the number one thing I would say is listen to your body.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Listen to your body, because it's really intimidating when you go to a provider and they dismiss your symptoms, or they say you're fine. And if you talk to your friends, it's like, oh, everybody's tired, everybody's anxious, everybody's got fatigue, right? But those symptoms are your body trying to tell you something. And you might not be the medical expert, but you are an expert in you, and what feels right. And it's not okay to be tired all the time. It's not okay to have joint pain. It's not okay to feel bloated. And so just start asking the whys and find a practitioner who will go on that journey with you.
Yeah. And sometimes with the really complex chronic stuff, I mean, what we tell our patients at the clinic is, if we don't have a clear answer right away, find a provider who's willing to say, I don't know, but we will walk this path together until we get the right answers.
Yes.
And that's how you're in the right place. Because nobody has all the answers to begin with.
No.
But Galaxy Diagnostics is helping us get better answers, like you said, so that we know what fight we're in so we can win it.
Absolutely.
Which is amazing. I appreciate you so much. We mentioned to go to the website, Galaxy Diagnostics. You guys are also on social.
Yes, we are on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn.
All the places.
Definitely follow us there. That's another good way to get notified if we have new information, new studies, new webinars, new approaches. It's a great way to get notified. So you can definitely follow us there. And then anybody who's interested in my journey and story can find my book on Amazon. It's What Lurks in the Woods.
Yes.
And I've been told it's an easy read. I think it's good for folks that, it's not a happy ending story, unfortunately.
Right. We already know how it ends.
There's a lot of people that, have reached out to me after the fact and said, I thought I was on my own. I didn't understand it. Like, it was really validating to read the story. I tell other people that are sick, maybe you don't want to read the story because it doesn't end well, but you can give it to the people around you. So maybe they have some empathy for what you're going through, because it is chaotic. It is lonely. It is just completely life-changing. And if it can help validate or explain people's circumstances in any way, and then that makes it worth the journey, right? To be able to help other folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes the most empowering things in life don't have happy endings. So I think listeners are already prepared. The value of the book is so much greater than is it warm and fuzzy, and your bravery of sharing your journey and your husband's journey and your family's journey and then, taking it to that next step of like, okay, I'm going to solve part of this problem. I'm going to be part of the solution. Really, really grateful that you guys are moving the needle with testing, because it's the only way we can move the needle with treatment.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
So,
well, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing with us. For everyone listening, remember you can get the transcripts and show notes and links by visiting inspiredliving.show. I hope you had a great time and enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to Inspired Living with Autoimmunity, hosted by Julie Houghton, your autoimmune coach. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone in your life who needs to hear it. For the complete show notes, links, transcripts, and everything discussed today, visit inspiredliving.show. You can also send in your questions there to be answered by Julie in a future episode. That's inspiredliving.show. Remember, it's time to take your power back.